thanks. Hi, I'm Luisa Blanco. I am a professor of economics at Pepperdine University, and I am part of the analysis core in RCMAR CHIME, and it's a delight for me to be able to introduce Gary Ryan to give us, share with us his expertise today. So I'm going to keep my introduction kind of brief so that we really get Gary to cover. He'll have a lot to cover. But let me mention quickly, so his presentation will really focus on qualitative data analysis and the methodologies to do that. And again, it is my pleasure to introduce Gary as our distinguished behavioral scientist, methodologist, and evaluator who has expertise in qualitative and exploratory methodologies, mixed methods design, implementation, assessment, and evaluation of complex systems intervention. He was trained as a medical anthropologist and methodologist. His research covers a wide range of topics such as mental and physical health, HIV, homelessness, social networks, human trafficking, and alternative medicine, among other things. He has worked extensively in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, addressing critical health and educational challenges. And he's currently a professor of health system science at Kaiser Permanente, Bernard Tyson School of Medicine, and a senior advisor for the RCMAR CHIME at the UCLA Department of Medicine. As a side note, I am an economist who had no idea how to do qualitative research, and I learned from Gary, and he was always so generous and is still very generous whenever I reach out to him. I even, some of his material, I even use it for my classes with my students. I teach a capstone where I ended up getting my students to do qualitative work. So please join me to welcome Gary. The presentation today will last around 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. Of course, Gary, I think you'll be fine if people jump in with questions, right?
Yes, please. Jump in, put it in the chat, yell out. I don't care. Doesn't matter. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Well, I'll hand it out to you. Please join me to welcome Gary, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Anytime. All right. So we have an impossible task. We have to cover this thing called qualitative analysis writ large in 45 minutes. So what I'm going to ask you to do in order to do this is to completely suspend everything you've ever been heard and been taught about qualitative analysis. And let's try to start with a blank slate. All right, so throw out all the jargon you hold in your head. If you've read those books or read articles, just completely forget about it for now, and then you can go reread them after we've had a conversation. All right, so let's talk about what we want to do. We want to talk about what we mean by qualitative data analysis. We want to talk about different types of analysis. We want to talk about how does this qualitative analysis piece fit into your overall research design and enterprise. And we want to literally go through what are the absolute fundamental basics of what qualitative analysis is. All right, and once we have that, then you can go back and figure out exactly how you're going to pull this off in your own research, because there's a million variations. All right, so what do we mean by qualitative data analysis? So I'm going to take you back to middle school. Remember in middle school, we did grammar, and qualitative here is an adjective. And if I remember correctly, adjectives modify nouns. So the challenge is, what does qualitative modify? Does it modify data or does it modify analysis? And it actually kind of helps to think that it actually modifies both. So let's look at what happens if that's true. So let's take qualitative and quantitative analysis and qualitative and quantitative data. All right, so we know what is in the cell in the bottom right. Quantitative analysis, quantitative data is statistics, mathematical analysis of numeric data. It's find patterns numerically, probabilistically. We also sort of know what a quantitative analysis of qualitative data are. This is basically turning words into numbers, or classic content analysis. You can do semantic network analysis. You can do natural language processing, all the stuff behind the scenes that say, if I turn these in the words into numbers, put them in a giant matrix, I can find patterns that way, okay? What the qualitative analysis of qualitative data, we've been doing this literally for centuries. It's basically exegesis. It means we've done this on sacred text forever, but it's how do you interpret what something means? That's really what the qualitative analysis actually signals. What is the meaning of this? All right. And then what we tend to forget is the qualitative analysis of quantitative data is what we do when we look at our results. What do the results mean? So if you run a regression, for example, and you get a p-value of 0.051, you have to decide how to interpret that. If I give you a graph and I plot the graph on a piece of paper and you look at it, you have to basically analyze it and interpret, what does this mean? Is that a steep enough slope to make a big deal about or not, for example, right? So what we're going to concentrate on is the upper left-hand box today. But one of the things I want everybody to take away is you can't escape judgments. You're going to have to make judgments whenever you do anything qualitative in terms of analysis, all right? You're going to have to make choices. And that's the fundamental rub, because it makes it really hard for you to sort of tell people what that process looks like. And that's why qualitative tends to look fuzzy. So what are the types of qualitative analysis? I'm going to just give you one way of separating off in sort of a taxonomy of all the stuff that's out there, right? And this is really crude, but it really sometimes helps to figure out where you're not working, if you will. All right, so if we start off with qualitative data, say you got a bunch of interviews. One of the things you can look at is that the two big splits in the methodological literature is sometimes we're using the qualitative data as sort of windows into people's experiences or windows into the world. And sometimes we're actually looking at the data and we're asking questions of that data itself. How is this data constructed? All right. So on the right-hand side, this is the analysis of conversations, performance, linguistics, narrative. So if you hear, oh, that's a conversation analysis, or you hear somebody say, I'm doing a narrative analysis or a performance analysis, what they're really doing is trying to understand however this thing they're looking at was created. So in the health sector, you see this primarily when you're looking at doctor-patient conversations. Is people are analyzing that turn-taking, what is said, what is not said. That falls over here on this side, all right? It's not looking for themes or per se, it's sort of looking at the production of text as opposed to using it as to seeing a phenomenon. So on the phenomena side, you sort of have two types of data. You have very structured qualitative data that are generated from free list or pile sorts or that sort of stuff. And we're going to use a whole bunch of different types of analyses to look at that. We're not going to talk about that today. Those are going to be very quantitative. All right, so these are some of the examples you might use to analyze those types of qualitative data. Again, not talking about that today. What we're really talking about is the free-flowing text, like you see in interviews. All right, so these fall into two buckets. One is we can just analyze the words. All right, so we can do keywords and context, pull all the sentences where the word fear appears or some connotation. We can do semantic networks where you go words, and you put them in space. It looks like a word cloud, for example. All right, these are analysis of your data, but based on the words. You could also do based on codes. This is where most of us live and work. Right. So the exploratory stuff is when you have an exploratory question, you want to understand how something works. You come in naive and you're exploring. Right. What you're going to see are things like thematic analysis, grounded theory, phenomenology, all fall under this category. Confirmatory, however, is different. Here, what you're doing is you're not exploring, you're actually testing a hypothesis. So here, what you're going to do, this is what comes under classic content analysis or content dictionaries. where you have a hypothesis, you're going to take a bunch of data, you're going to code that qualitative data into variables, and then you're going to use the variables to test your hypothesis. Pretty straightforward. All right, mixed method, again, we're not going to talk about this, is where you actually combine sort of exploratory and confirmatory. Again, all we're going to concentrate on today is this little box here. All right, so all the other stuff out there in the qualitative world, we're not going to cover. There are ways to look at this and so forth, but let's focus here right now. So let's talk about how the analysis, the qualitative exploratory analysis, fits into your overall research design. Now, what we did previously, I did a whole session on collecting qualitative data, and we laid out, here are the basic steps, okay? So on the first thing is you got to figure out, you got to pick something you're interested in looking at. You want to know, what are your research questions? Why is this important? How is this innovative? What do you want to address? And we already know this. This is sort of your literature review. So think of all these first steps as something you would write in your background, your first page of a proposal. This is all about scoping. All right? You got to scope it down. You're making choices of what's important, what's not. Then you're going to you got to figure out, where am I going to collect data from? Am I going to get it from secondary sources, or am I going to get it from human beings? This is essentially sampling. But within the sample, you got to figure out, of all the things in the secondary data, which ones do I choose? Which text do I pick? Or how do I develop an interview? What's my interview guide going to look like? So this is your data collection. Then you got to manage it. In our case, we're going to manage it through software like NVivo or Deduce or Atlas TI or whatever. And then you're going to run some analyses, okay? And so you're going to look for patterns here. And unfortunately, the analysis doesn't end the process. The analysis just produces output, which you are going to have to interpret. Now, in the applied world, we don't stop here. We actually move on to the question of, who are you going to show the results to, and how are you going to communicate? Because you're actually doing all this to influence other people to make change, right? So this is your communication dissemination. I want to point out that as you decide to disseminate, when you're writing that research article, that manuscript, you're actually doing another form of scoping, because you can't do it all. All the stuff you find when you explore, you're going to have to make a lot of choices of what to ultimately include in your end product, right? So boils down to the following. You got to decide, what is the thing I'm studying? What do I want to understand about it? How am I going to get information about it? How am I going to find stuff? In this case, exploratory. How am I going to find pattern? And then how am I going to communicate the results, right? So analysis fits in this whole process in the flows. So let's talk about right at the end. If I do my analysis, what am I trying to do? Well, in your results section of your manuscript, you're going to describe, first of all, what did I see? What is there? What did I discover? How are things related to each other? Things I discover, how are those things related to each other or other things? Or how do things work? How do I explain this phenomenon? You're also going to describe things that you saw. And in that description, you're going to have some things that should sound exactly like basically univariate statistics. You're going to first want to talk about the range of things you saw on this particular topic area. You're going to talk about what you saw as most important, right? And I'm going to use salience as the word that here for what is most important to cover, right? You can also think of it as what is most common, what is typical. This is essentially central tendency in univariate statistics. And then ultimately, if you're going to talk about what's common, you got to talk about what's varied. And how does that vary? Where do all these themes or things that you saw, when do they appear, when do they not appear? That's distribution and variation. You also might want to do some comparisons between groups, or you might want to explain a phenomena in terms of how did it come to be, sort of a causal mechanism, right? That's what happens in the results. But in many ways, when you write an article in the applied world, you're essentially using your results to set up your discussion. In your discussion, what you're really trying to ask is, so given what I found, what does this mean for other people? For whom? Who do I want to influence? What do I want to tell people to do? So the results section is just straight up, here's what I saw. Here are the facts. All right, here are my observations. Here's what people told me. Nothing more. And the results section is, now this is your soapbox. How can I take what I found and get people to recognize this is important, and what are the implications? What do I want to tell them they need to do given what I found, right? So that's going to set up, that's going to come right after sort of the analysis. So what did I find? What does it mean? Now, probably the most important part of this whole talk to understand what qualitative is sitting in this slide right here. So we're going to ask, what is the role of the qualitative analysis? So let's just sort of walk through the process again. So we start off with from whom and where you're collecting data. That's my sampling. All right. I'm going to sample a bunch of interviewees. Okay. Then what am I going to collect from each of these interviewees? This is essentially my interview guide. Now, what that's going to produce is a whole bunch of interviews and ultimately transcripts, right? Then we're going to do this thing called qualitative analysis. And we're hoping that that will help us get to the next step, which is how you're going to communicate the results, which looks like this. You got an intro, background, methods, results, discussions. And who should see your results and how will they use them? This is going to turn out to be another group, let's call them the audience. All right. Now, qualitative analysis is that spot that allows you to jump as a role, jump from all these interviews to that manuscript. All right. So let's use an example here. Let's take 20 interviews, and I got this case, I'm going to use a NSP fellow example, and they were interested in how does home-based hospital care work from the perspective of emergency room docs and administrators of hospitals. So he goes out and he finds 10 institutions, and he does 2 interviews at each institution, one with an emergency doc and one with an administrator. All right. That generates, he wants to cover 4 main topics in an interview guide. Let's say they're, things around perception of risk, logistics and staffing. How is this actually going to get pulled off? What are the implications for the emergency room versus what are the implications for the hospital in terms of financing and staffing and so forth? So those are the general areas. It's got a very nice, clean protocol to cover these. What's going to generate is those 20 interviews is going to generate a set of transcripts that's got over 300 pages. All right. So imagine you got to read 300 single-space pages of transcript. Now, let's jump to where he wants to go. He's going to try to write a manuscript. He's going to publish it in the health field. On average, you don't have probably more than 5 or 6 pages of results, and you might have basically 1 page of discussion. So you're going to have to take your 300 pages and you're going to have to somehow reduce it down to 5, 6 if you're lucky, right? So one way to think about analysis is not to think about the actual techniques and all the jargon that goes with it, but to actually look and go, actually, analysis here is really about data reduction. It's about organizing all we saw in the 300 pages, synthesizing, prioritizing, and scoping down to what do I want to include in my manuscript, right? And there are going to be tons of judgments. So no matter what you do, when you think about qualitative research, you have to recognize that it is this reduction process. It's the steps that you go from lots of stuff down to very specific and targeted stuff. all right? It is going to take a ton of scoping and many decisions. Another way to actually look at it too is you can also look at it as the movement of what you heard from your interviewees. These are the people that let you into their lives, gave you information, and they're giving you information. Usually it's not because of the nice little gift cards you give them. They're giving you information because they hope that you will take what they say and move it to people who can actually make their lives better. That's your audience. That's who you're really trying to influence. So another way to look at qualitative analysis is, how do I translate what I heard and give voice for those people on the interview side to other people who might be able to use that information to make decisions. All right. So as we go through this, when we start to talk about techniques, I want to keep reminding you to come back to how qualitative analysis is going to require you to wrap your head around this complex set of information, facts, reports that you got. And how do you turn it into something that's influential? Okay. Making sense so far? Questions? Dead silence. Jim's nodding. Jim, good enough. Head bobbing. All right, so what are the basics now? What are absolutely fundamentally you're not going to be able to escape, no matter which technique, which method you use, it's all going to require this. And to me, it boils down to these four things. And you're going to start to see, I start to blend the data analysis in with my reporting and writing up, okay? So the first thing you're going to have to do is identify themes or stuff, right? This is the discovery process. In that, you're going to have to build and apply code books. Eventually, when you write this up, you are going to have to describe your themes minimally, all right? You're going to minimally get into a descriptive. If you want to do comparison and explanation too, that's also in there. And eventually, you have to disseminate your work. So let's talk about identifying themes. So what are themes? All right, this is, in the social sciences, this is probably the most abstract thing that we talk about. What is a theme? Well, a theme, you know you found a theme when you can say, what is this an expression or an example of? What is this thing an example of? As soon as you say it's an example of, you've essentially identified a theme. Now notice what's happening here. Themes are actually data reduction tools, because what you're doing is you're taking an instance and dropping it into a category. All right, that higher level category becomes the reduction mechanism to take a whole bunch of instances and make sense of them. Right. By the way, there's a whole bunch of words that we use for themes. So one of them is a category or a subcategory. And this is one of the other problems we have in the qualitative world is we use lots of different words that have similar or at least a big overlapping meanings. So how big are themes? They can be super huge. Anxiety that sort of permeates are very, very specific. A type of fear, for example. Where do themes come from? Another important point. They can come from a priori. You know what you're looking for. You know that it should be there. That's in what we call a structural or deductive coding theme. Or you're going to pick it out from what you heard. That's the inductive part. Okay? And how do we identify salient themes? So salience is really about what is important. And the question is, what's important to whom? To you, or to your audience, or to the people you interviewed? So one of the ways we often think about salience is by counting how often something occurs, how often the theme is present, or how ubiquitous it is across different settings and conditions. So if people bring the thing up a lot in different, circumstances, then it's probably more salient than if they just mention it in one particular context. Another way to look at themes is how people react, right? Are they Do the emotions go up? Do you hear changes in voice tone? All right. Do people start crying? All right. And then the degree to which the number four, so you're putting all this together and you're making some really executive decisions about what's going to turn out, what to include and what not to include. So notice what we've done in themes. We've done two things. We've found it. This belongs to a category. We have to identify the category. And we also simultaneously have to identify, of all the categories we see, what are most important to include or not include in our early analysis or ultimately in our manuscript, right? So everything sort of focuses around, first and foremost, on identifying themes and identifying salience. So how do you identify themes? Now, here's part of the rub. There's a whole bunch of ways that people have talked about identifying themes. And in the qualitative space, we have essentially zero evidence. There's no methodological evidence. People have not looked at whether or not one way of looking for themes makes a difference than another way. We just don't know empirically how this plays out. But here are some examples. So Russ Bernard and I wrote an article a long time ago, and we identified 12 different ways of finding themes. The first way is, what do you look for? So these are the examples of what we saw across the social science literature, what people look for. So they look for repetition, but they also look for indigenous categories or typologies or phrases that people are using that are sort of code words for whatever they're talking about, right? I know other people that have gone through their entire transcripts and simply look for metaphors or analogies. And these are really powerful because what metaphors and analogies do is they take concepts and tie them together into relationships. Simple enough that people will sit there and have, oh yeah, I get that. So there's an anthropologist that looked at marriage, and she literally had thousands of pages of transcripts of talking to couples about marriage. And she just went through and found all these metaphors and things like, oh, our marriage was like a rock. All right. And that tells you about something. That metaphor tells you about durability and resilience. All right. And those become themes in our mind as a way to identify. Linguistically, when we write, we actually write things in sentences and paragraphs. Each sentence we learned in going back to middle school in grammar, each sentence represents a single thought, and a paragraph is the thoughts on a particular topic, right? So those are all, each one of those grammatical things can be used for identifying themes. Other people have gone through and gone line by line. This comes out of when we used to use colored markers and notes in the margins. And people would read each line or each paragraph and ask the question, so how is this paragraph or this line different from the other one? The answer to that is always a theme, right? Linguistic connectors like because, since, rather than, etc., are also used as finding themes because they're connecting concepts. Missing data, this is really tough to identify, but it's what people don't talk about. If it's, it should be there, but it isn't mentioned, that actually becomes a theme, right? I often have in my code book, as I'm going through this, I have stuff I don't know what to do with theme, and I just dump stuff into that, right? And then you have all the a priori stuff that you get from theoretical, reading articles before, from basically outside your interview process. So that's what you look for. There's another way to find themes is what you do, okay? And what you do here are 3 examples of what you do. The first one is the kindergarten version of theme finding. You literally take quotes from your text, you print them off on a piece of paper, you cut them out, you put the ID of whoever said it on the back. And then you take those pieces of slips of paper and you look at them and you start putting them into piles. It's essentially a physical pile sort. All right. Now, it really helps to have a really big table. It also helps to actually do this as a group. All right. So that's another way to find themes. And what'll happen is when you put those quotes into piles based on similarities of something, you have to then name the pile. That's a theme. All right. So it's really easy to do. It's really easy to explain how you did it. Another way to find themes is just look at word list or keywords and concepts. Or you could look at word-word co-occurrences, what words go with what. But these are things you can do. I usually find the easiest for me is actually the cutting and sorting. For some reason, that tactile, moving things around and having conversations with others as you're doing it really helps to figure out not only what is there, but what is important. What are you really trying to get at? Okay. So that's how you find them. Now let's talk about code books. So you're not going to, almost always you're going to do this, like I said, in some sort of qualitative data management software. And so you're going to build code books. So let's talk about code books, coding and codes. So what's the difference? All codes is a shorthand and mnemonic for a theme, right? Code books are nothing more than literally organized list of themes. Think outline in Word, right? In coding, what it means is you're literally looking at text and you're going, this block of text is associated with this theme. And so almost all of the software programs now allow you to open a window with your code book and have that window open as you're reading the text. And you can literally highlight a block of text and you can drag the theme onto the text, and now there's a link. So that's all coding is linking incidences with these abstract, bigger, higher level categories. All right. Now, again, two types of codes. The structural codes, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, these are deductive. These are the things that you know a priori before you even start coding that they're going to be important, that you're going to want to look at, right? So you can either use these as a description of the data. You know, this was covered in section A of the interview protocol, or this is a characteristic of the person, my interviewee, social demographics. All right. Or yeah, the one I use most often is this is covered in my interview protocol. So your interview protocol, if you've done a good job of thinking about and really spending time developing an interview protocol, it actually sets up what you're going to cover. And what you don't ever want to do in your analysis is you do not want to discover your protocol or your interview guide, right? So this is one way to help make sure that you're not doing that, because you've already figured out what the themes are from your interview guide. Then you have thematic codes, which are the inductive piece. This is where you look at the data, and this is where the pile sort comes in, or the, looking line by line. What do I see in the data? What is the data, quote, telling me? All right, these are the inductive codes. And then another thing you may hear as you read the literature, people will talk about it, are memos. Think of memos as post-its to yourself. They can be about themes, they can be about methods, they can be about insights that you have and you don't want to forget, right? So that's what you're going to see. These are the basics that you're going to see in all the software. So let's talk about what a code description looks like. And this actually, if you do this right, as you're building your code book should be sort of a living document. You're constantly adapting it as you go. And if you really do it well, the code book becomes the basis for how you write and describe the theme in your paper. Now look at how we've sort of divided up these different types of codes. So this is taken from, oh my God, 30 plus years ago during my dissertation. So at this point, I was looking at how do lay people make choices when they get sick. Small little village in Cameroon. All right. And so we had OTC, over-the-counter drugs. And so here's what you want is a detailed description. In this case, the use of pharmaceutical products purchased over the counter without a prescription, which is key, and with the expressed intent of alleviating signs and symptoms. Now that definition evolved over time. Inclusion criteria, you want inclusion and exclusion. So inclusion, non-prescription medications purchased over the counter for a current illness. Exclusion, medications that were recommended by a doctor or a professional for the current illness episode. So they're basically prescriptions. Or medications purchased for preventative purposes. So if you get vitamins, we're not going to count those as OTC. Typical exemplars: aspirin, congestive, laxative, cough medicine, fever reduction type stuff, that sort of thing. Atypical, this would be what is actually inside that counts, but is sort of on the periphery. So eventually I decided that prescription medication was left over from a previous illness would actually count, and I'd drop that into the OTC bucket. Right. So in this case, we saw lots of examples where people had, or somebody in the household or compound had an illness, they had a bunch of medication laying around, and this illness looks somewhat similar, we'll use whatever we had left over. All right. So close but no are vitamins. So essentially what you're doing as you describe this in this description, think of this almost like you're describing the boundaries of an amoeba with all these pseudopods and how odd shaped it is. So this sort of gets you at what that shape looks like. All right. And like I said, if you do this well, you just keep adding as you go where it counts. Right. Same thing for home remedies. You'll see the same sort of process. So how do you develop a code book? Sort of following on the same issue. I usually start with the a priori, and then I look and I do the inductive. All right. So you start off with what do I already know from usually, again, from my interview guide. And then I start looking at what happens when what does the data say within that interview guide? Some sort of combination. Then you got to figure out how you organize this. So what's going to happen in your code book is you're going to have these themes, which are going to also have sub-themes. In outline language, they refer to it as parents and children. All right. Inclusive codes or themes in this case mean that you can have a chunk of text and I can apply multiple codes to it. An exclusive code means I can only apply one code at a time to this particular text. So if you're going to have a code like color and you have sub-themes of different types of color, or let's say you have an emotion and then different types of emotion, then the color would probably be exclusive and you could have multiple emotions at the same time with the same text. Hope that makes sense. Questions so far? Crickets. Okay. How should be a code book? This is going to be important. You do not want a big code book. Codes are data reduction instruments, okay? So there's a huge danger in code book proliferation, meaning that you keep adding, oh, here's another example. Well, here's another theme, and here's another theme. And very quickly, your code book goes from 5 to 10 things, big things that you're interested in, to 50 and 100. If you got that many, I will guarantee you when you go from your 300 pages down to your 5 pages in your manuscript, the vast majority of your codes are never going to be included. So be selective. That's not efficient to get all this stuff done. So my recommendation is build your code book for the paper you're writing next. Code one paper at a time. Then, so essentially what I'm telling you to do is, since qualitative analysis is scoping and data reduction, go to your paper and say, what paper do I want to write? What are the things that I need to look for in that paper? And use those as your starting point for your code book. Get paper 1 out of the way, and then figure out if you have another paper, then go after paper 2. All right. The other thing is you don't want a large code book, because if you got a code, if you got 50 codes and you're reading a text, it's going to be a nightmare for you to remember what things are in that code book. So another general rule is I never want a code book that's over a page long that I can just put right in front of me on my computer and I can look down and I know how to mark things really easily. Right? You got to keep it in memory. How many levels? As absolutely few as possible. Because again, when you write this stuff up, think about how many themes do you think you can cover in 5 pages? Actually, not very many, right? And if you do cover a lot, you're going to cover them really, really lightly and in super broad strokes. So you can't do a code book, you cannot cover a code book that has lots of codes and lots of subcodes or levels underneath. Just not going to fit in that space. And essentially what you're doing is you're skipping the fundamental piece of what is important. Again, you can't escape that. And you and your team are going to have to decide as you write that paper what is important for that audience. It's not just the paper, but it's the audience that you've got to think about. Okay? So I'm going to talk about this. The simplest approach that I have is this is how I do mine, is I use a multi-step analysis plan. All right. And so here's what I just say. Step one, just deductive coding. I'm going to use my interview guide to identify 3 to 5 core topic themes that I want to explore. These are the things I'm going to likely write on in my first paper. I'm going to go through my text and in this first stage, and I'm going to speed code as fast as I can anytime I see an instance that remotely touches one of these 3 core topics or these 3 core themes, right? And the rule is, when in doubt, if I'm not really sure if that chunk of text belongs in this code, I mark it. Doesn't matter, because I'm going to have ample opportunity to throw out false positives, if you will, right? This is the step that I usually have research assistants do because it's really easy. They're not making any executive decisions. They're not making fine decisions. I am not worried about intercoder reliability at all. As a matter of fact, I'm hoping even if I send 2 coders at it, they'll pick up things that the first coder missed. All right. So this is to make sure I haven't missed anything. That's what this whole first step is for these big categories, these big themes. And the second step is for each of the core themes, I pull all the quotes, everything I've marked. All right. Now, what I just told you, how I find the sub-themes, this is the inductive part. How I find the sub-themes is I literally cut them out on pieces of paper. I might have 50, 100, 200 pieces of paper, and then I just sort them into themes, into my little piles. I name those piles. All right. Again, I've done this with large groups. I've done this with community members. I've done this with people who I interviewed. And so you get to decide who has got lenses onto these quotes that get to decide what the core thematic structures are. Right? Pretty easy to explain. And then third, sometimes I actually want to make comparisons between groups. The beauty of this method, this sort of approach, this 2-step, now 3-step approach, is if I've written the IDs on the back of the quotes, now I have them in piles. All I have to do is turn over the quotes and I can look at the distribution of themes across all my interviews. In this case, the example I use, if I have, administrators and emergency docs, and I want to see how they are similar and how they spontaneously mention themes and sub-themes, all I have to do is turn them over. And what I'm counting here is actually not the number of times the person mentioned it, but the number of people who mentioned it. All right. So if I got 10 administrators and 10 docs and all 10 mentioned something spontaneously, then I'm pretty sure that both of these groups share this theme. Right? That's pretty powerful. Now, a couple of things. As I explain this, I imagine most of you are actually thinking about either watching me do it, all these steps, or you yourself doing it, correct? Right? So what you did, in all I described is I described what I did to find the themes, what the process was. And I'm intentionally creating images in the reviewer or the reader's heads so they will head bob because they understand it. It's not magical anymore. And second, I have zero jargon. Right? So what I see all the time is people coming in and talking about, well, what type of analysis I'm doing. Forget the stupid labels. If anything, just say I'm doing a thematic analysis and I'm doing a 2 or 3 stage thematic analysis, and let me describe each phase. Now you don't get clobbered by saying I'm doing grounded theory, because the people who don't understand qualitative don't understand that's a mystery term. They throw their hands up. And if you are an expert in qualitative, those people are going to frame you too, because they're going to ask, well, which type of grounded theory are you using? Are you using the Miles or the Straussian version or the Charmes's version, or it's just not worth it. So skip the jargon. Just tell people what you did. Right? Describing themes. Again, it's going to come back to these three things: range, central tendency or salience, distribution. You're going to have details, examples, and you're going to have context. Right? What is absolutely the most critical to recognize is the power of your analysis, how confident you are, and how generalizable your results are actually all in the range. Right? If you see an example of something and you know it's an example, then that means that theme is included in the phenomena everywhere, always. Right? You don't know how often it occurs, but you know it belongs in the range and you're 100% confident about that. Now, if you want to do salience, you can say, well, I'm also pretty confident about how important this is. Now, you're not looking, salience isn't, I'm trying to predict 27% of people mention this spontaneously versus 32. I'm literally doing it at this crude level of, everybody mentioned it, most people mention it, some people mention it, a few people, no people mention it. It's an ordinal scale of salience. All right. And I'm pretty confident in that. Right. So the way you actually write this stuff, and again, I'm bleeding over into the writing up as part of the analysis, is as you describe your themes, you're constantly going between high-level generalized statements and incidents, actual real incidents and examples. Right? So you're going to weave in together, you're going to talk range, salience, distribution, context in the, let's say you're writing one paragraph on one theme, you should have all of those in that description. And you're going to mix up quotes, paraphrases, exemplary things, examples, vignettes, etc. So there's different ways to bring in the data into this paragraph. You don't have to have full block quotes. And then disseminating your work. Let's talk about what you want in your method section. No jargon, like we just said. Describe what you did. Help the reader see the process, and constantly link back to what you collected and what you're trying to accomplish in your research. So that's got to be in your method section. The results section, I always have an intro and I lay out the storyline in the intro of what I'm going to cover with a theme. So I help people anticipate the roadmap. I'm organizing. It's critical that you organize. So I usually have folks, when they get done doing their analysis or doing their data collection, they've read the transcript and say, okay, tell me two things. What did you find? And what do you want to tell people you saw? And what do you want to tell people you do? So you're getting a story there. And I'm putting together all these themes to tell my story. I'm guiding them with my subheaders in the results section. Right? Then again, each thing has got to talk about the range of things that were mentioned, focus on the sub-theme, what is most salient, etc. Again, I'm writing to create images in my readers' heads. All right. This is critical because I'm trying to get them to understand things that I heard from one group that they may not have ever heard as the audience, another group. And ultimately, like I said, your discussion is your soapbox. What are the implications? What worked? What are the implications of your work? What do you want people to do? All right. Takeaways. Keep coming back to analysis is the linking of really a giant chunk of stuff to a reduced, synthesizing, organized story. All right. It doesn't work very well to think that I'm going to do my analysis and then I'm going to write my paper. You've got to really think through the entire process. So in many ways, it's sort of, instead of working forward, work backwards. Ask, what do I want to tell? Who's my audience? What do I want to say to them? How am I going to organize? What do they need to understand? If I want to tell them to do X, what do they need to know of what I found and how I got to why I think they need to do X? That's the organization of our results section. Second, no jargon, keep it simple. Describe the steps so everybody can find. You're never going to be able to describe that instantaneous moment you made a judgment. But what you can do is you can set up and let the reader understand the process by which you did to actually come to make that a judgment, not the judgment itself. Lastly, be efficient. I think it's far more efficient to scope based on the paper you write, your first paper, and do the scoping early than do it later. All right, don't overbuild your code book. And finally, you are telling a story. You're writing like a novelist to generate ideas and pictures in people's head when you write this manuscript. So that's the way you want to be thinking of organizing the manuscript, just like a novelist tells their story through chapters. All right, you're doing the same thing through paragraphs or subheaders. You're sort of setting the stage and walking them through. That's it. That's qualitative analysis in 50 minutes. Questions? Anybody?
Thank you. I'm just gonna jump in right away. It was amazing. I felt like this presentation was so helpful. So you'll share the slides, right?
Yep.
Okay.
Charles got all the slides.
Okay, and you are okay with like sometimes reusing them and mentioning
No, my God. I grew up, my professor, my dissertation chair, as a methodologist, would always say, you got to give it away to get it back. So everything I say, if you say it 3 times, it's yours.
Okay. I know you're always so generous. Okay, I will let people just jump in. I felt like Tim raised the hand.
Yeah.
Ahead,
and a quick one, circulating the slides after the meeting.
Thanks, Cheryl. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ryan. This is fantastic. I have 2 questions, if I can be a little greedy.
Yeah,
sure. One practical, one philosophical. The practical is I'm thinking of in terms of just coding discipline and not jumping to themes, kind of going from Saldana to Brown and Clark. When I'm looking through some of this data, I just kind of find myself jumping to themes, jumping to conclusions, I'm trying to go through the steps. Do you have any advice on how to sort of slow yourself down and say, this is my first cycle of coding. I'm going and picking up and focusing on this one thing, and eventually I'll get to themes. I find myself jumping. I don't know if that's correct.
Yeah.
Any advice on how to think about that?
I do it with conversations. Is you need a sounding board. You probably need a couple of sounding boards. Talk to people about, look, keep in mind, you've done all the interviews, and then typically you've got this time before the transcripts come back, then you reread the transcript. So you've got now at least 2 shots at understanding this. And as you're doing that, ideas are popping up in your head. Now you can jot them down. That's that whole writing notes in the margin, that's your memo. Just go for it. But at the end of the day, you're still going to have to figure out what is important. And it's the conversations that start to help you understanding this. I guess I do not buy into that you need to not jump. Jumping sounds wrong. I mean, you don't have a choice. You're already doing it. So figure out what you want to tell people. And you're forced to do that when you have somebody who isn't living, breathing this like you. All right, I'm fortunate to have a partner that I can do this with, and it works really well. All right, but do it with a colleague or find somebody. I mean, my job most of the time is not methodology. My job is mostly as a sounding board. You need somebody to help craft that story. And you do one story at a time. These are short stories. It's not a whole, this is not War and Peace here, folks. That would be called a dissertation.
Thank you. That's super helpful. The other, and thank you, you've kind of taken a little burden off of me there. The second thing is more philosophical. It's, I'm emergency medicine at Harvard UCLA. We live in a quantitative world many times. what's your messaging to those in the quantitative world who may not understand? You're trying to explain what your purpose is with your research. How do you sort of interact with that different aspect, a different perspective?
Okay, that goes to your linking. So A, avoid jargon at all costs. B, if you're going to use jargon, you got to remember there's a prestige here between the quantitative methods have more prestige than the qualitative method. Confirmatory has more prestige than exploratory. So if you're going to use terms in jargon, it's got to be quantitative terms. So you have to as the lower prestige group, you have to translate into the higher prestige language. One. Two is you have to constantly be reminding people what you are trying to do. You have to remind them we don't know what is there. So the first question is, what is there? That is a discovery process to discover. So I write both papers and proposals using what I call the to construction. To do X, to accomplish X, I will do Y. And there's a million variation linguistically you can do, but you're constantly reminding people where you're trying to go in the next step and why this makes sense. And that is just pure logic. And I'm assuming my more quantitative colleagues are not illogical. So I win in the logic game, not in the jargon game.
I love it. A different type of code switching.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Jennifer.
That was phenomenal. Thank you so much. One request and then one question.
Okay.
Thank you for the slides in advance. I was trying to take notes as quickly as I could, so that would be really helpful. And then the follow-up request is if you have a manuscript about that you would want us to reference of how you describe this in the methodology. I could go down your, bio sketch but that would take me forever. You have two.
Okay, so here's the citation trick. All right, you're gonna out describe everybody of what you did and keep it really simple. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna find. It doesn't matter what reference. I mean, some of you, or Jim, you sped off some example references. Just say similar to, and then put a citation in for anything qualitative. Don't use the word grounded theory. If you want to use it, use grounded. Similar to this is a grounded approach, right? And so if you describe it and then you just simply say similar to, that's all you need. And you can do a combination of sort of purely methodological papers that or your colleagues know, or you can also do anything in the subject area. So somebody who's already done some similar qualitative around your particular topic, use them as especially if they've already published in the journal you're sending your manuscript to, use those citations because the journals love to have journal citations.
Perfect. And then my follow-up question is just, I'm in the neurology world, and so qualitative, we're getting there as far as the reviewers. So I really liked your approach of working together, even in a conference room with, flashcards, whatever, and working together in that analysis process. I feel like a lot of times people like independent analysis and then cross-checking. Have you gotten that feedback from reviewers? Yeah. And if so, how have you responded?
Okay, so this sort of touches on the using of multiple coders for reliability. The reliability thing is bullshit. Sorry. All right. It's because that's not what you're using the second coder for. What you're really using the second coder for is that you're not crazy. That if you so here's what I do. When I write an article, I never put in reliability measures at all in my first draft that I sent to the editors. I force the editors and the reviewers to demand that they want a reliability measure. Okay, then it's really easy to do following what we just did, because all I have to do is I built the code book. I know what my codes are with these quotes. So I'm coder 1. Now I just simply give my code book, which if you've done it well and you have all the description, and I give them a sample of quotes and I say, play Sesame Street, match the quotes with the code book. And now I can have two coders and I can calculate kappa. And I'm pretty sure the kappa is going to be high because it's kind of obvious. And the reason I'm doing it is just to say, look, if I can show people what this abstract construct is as a theme, and I can describe it and they can go find it consistent with me, then we're not both crazy. That's it, right? That's what you're really trying to do. Now, if you want to be communally engaged, having your community members or your CAB help you with this, or going back to the community and doing a presentation as like the final step. Here's what I found. Does this make sense to you? Now, keep in mind, this is only because you're writing about what the community thinks. Doesn't mean that your own analysis, which may differ from what the community thinks, is wrong. They're just two different perspectives, an outside perspective and an inside. But if you want the inside, get your insiders to help you code, get your insiders to do it sort of a check that, tell me where I got it right, tell me where I got it wrong, help me with this. And usually what happens is they all head bob and say, yeah, you sort of got it right, but you haven't added this, this, and this, and they give you more data, give you more details. So that's how I would do that.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Well, I think we have to wrap it up, right? To be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you so much. So I know this will be recorded and will be available in our website and the slides too. And it was such a great conversation and great presentation. And for those who want to stay longer, we're going to have a work in progress session with Chun-Li. But please, thank Dr. Gary Ryan for his awesome presentation. So if you stay for the work in progress, we'll stay in the same room, or are we switching rooms? I can't remember.
Same room.
Same
room. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you so much.
And if anybody wants to talk, just send me an email and we can have a conversation. I do this a lot. So
And please, okay, well, don't forget to fill out the evaluation. There's a link in the chat. And also circulates that link with the slides later today.